Good evening, and welcome to this evening's program. Again, I don't have the name Sunday Lime, Sunday Sit Down, whatever it is. I don't have the name yet. But welcome to this evening's program. Thank you for joining on yet another Sunday. It's always a pleasure having you with us. And without any hesitation, I'm going to bring in my brother, my co-host, my friend, Richard. I'm going to stop using the uplift with Cian Marshall theme song because it's not the same thing. So I'm gonna stop using the uplift with Cian Marshall theme song. And so I brought Richard in. Richard, good Sunday evening to you.
Good Sunday evening. The Marshal himself, the one with the plan, the Marshall plan. You know?
The one that saved Europe.
Yes, yes. Yeah, exactly. And you come right now trying to save them again, I see. Good
Yes.
afternoon to the world. Good afternoon to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Good morning, good night, good day wherever you are. Welcome to the Sunday show with the Marshal himself, the one with the plan.
Why you think about Sunday sit down, Richard? What do you think about Sunday sit down?
Um No, I think
Okay,
you
we
need
go figure it out afterwards. Is that
yeah,
right?
you need something more spicy. But what you have to remember, Cian, is that um get do a little promo to get people to follow this thing in terms of giving your name now, man. You have a special price for them. A price that they will never regret.
Yes, absolutely,
You know
absolutely.
it and you know it. So come on, man. Do something and get people to give you a name because the price that you're going to give them is extremely valuable. I can attest to that, and you know that that is true,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So get people involved in the thing. But I just want to say good night, good evening, good afternoon, or wherever you are in this world, and listening to us. Welcome to Sunday evening with the Marshall. that's what that's what I can say for now. Sunday evening with the Marshall. You know, I'm my name is Richard Barrett.
I just shared Richard, and so I'm going to have to ask you to
Okay,
share as
right.
well,
No, that is what I
right?
was
So I
looking for.
shared on my page,
I was waiting for the
and
share.
as people
I was
join,
waiting for the share.
yes,
I
as
was
people
waiting
join,
on you
I
to
would
share
ask
it.
them to share as well
Okay, so
on their own individual pages as well.
I'm on your
So as
page because I
sharing,
don't see it yet. I'm on your page right now, but I don't see it yet.
you need to refresh. Just refresh it,
Okay,
and
right. Now I see
yes,
it. Now I see it.
right.
Now it's there. All right.
Um,
Let me share.
so right, so I'm going to
All right. Let
share
me share.
this.
Okay.
Where is it
Right.
now?
I've shared, and I'm going to share on another platform I have here,
Right.
so that
Wonderful.
yeah.
Right. Okay, I see that you share it. Nice, no
Yeah.
problem. Right. So, where are we now? Where is it now? I am not. Let me get this again because I'm still sharing. And
Yeah. That's
as
what I'm actually
always,
doing as I speak.
as always, I ask those who are logged on and joining us to share as well. So I'm sharing. Where are we now?
Right. So
Yes,
I
that's
share it on
good.
the two platforms I have. Okay. Now, if I may see, uh, just to say to everybody, you have a very special show lined up for them tonight. A very
Yes,
special
absolutely.
a very special guest, and what you're going to discuss tonight has impact not just for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but for the world. And this is important to understand. Um, as you know, Cian, uh, we have a situation where the world is pretty close to nuclear catastrophe. You know that yourself. What is happening in Ukraine?
Hmm.
What is happening in Gaza? And the provocation that China is presently being subjected to in the South China Sea. Okay, so all of these things are things that could lead to nuclear war, and those are serious, serious issues. And
Well,
I think
the thing about it, Richard, even before we get into that, I just, like you said, I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping, and just to mention again that there is a special gift that is there for anyone who would come up with assist us in coming up with a name if your name is chosen, if the name for the program is chosen. So please give us some ideas. All right. Also, this evening we have a special guest with us, someone who was an uplet with Sayard Marshall, but we decided that we're going to have him on the Sunday afternoon program instead, where we'd have a much longer time and could really dig in and delve in, because we had a really good program the last time, covered so many different things. And as always, because the program is only 1 hour, it was done in no time. But he promised that he would come back, and he's going to be with us this evening, this afternoon, as you're watching us there in St. Vincent and the Grenadines as well. So that is happening next week. Richard will be in studio with us, so we're looking forward to that. Richard, I'm absolutely seriously looking forward to that. That's happening next week, right here on our Sunday program. So lots of things happening lined up. Our guest will join in a couple of minutes. Our guest will be joining at about 10 past 9. So be prepared for that. Richard, have you been following what was happening in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Let's good evening to Ev, who's just logged on. Ev, good evening. And as always, share the program. Have you been following what's going on in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? We had Parliament this week, and one of the bills that came up had to do with the government's attempt at controlling alcohol at funerals.
yes,
If you heard the debate in Parliament, you
yes,
would think
I
that the
heard it
government was
today.
trying to do something
Yeah.
negative.
Yeah, I actually I was on Star Radio on Friday morning, where it was it Friday morning, I don't remember. But anyway, I had a detailed discussion on the matter. Um, you know, Sian, I'm sure you may have read a bit of Mia Angelou's poetry and writing. I'm pretty sure about that, right? And Mia Angelou once said this: when people show you who they are, believe them. Not when people tell you what they are, not when other people tell you what these people are. You understand? Not when these people profess X or Y in words, but when they show you who they are. And the opposition in the House of Parliament in St. Vincent and the Grenadines have shown us who they are, you know? And this many times, and this is another case in point. And I hope that the people of our country are seeing, listening, following, and understanding. You know, it is seeing. You come from a Christian family. Am I right on that?
You're absolutely right.
Right. As far as I know, Mrs. Marshall, who is also like a mother to me in my relation with her and when we talk and so on, it's a deeply Christian woman. Not just a Christian woman, but a deeply Christian woman. And one of the things you learned as a child, I learned it as well, is that at a funeral, we're there to pay what? Our last what?
Respects.
Our last respect. Do you pay your last respect by drunkenness and misbehavior and so on? Is that respect? Is that really respect? St. Vincent and the Grenadines has, or have, if you want to call us a multi-island state in that sense, a tradition of respecting the dead. A matter of fact, seeing
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I grew up where you say you never say anything bad about the dead.
Yes.
You understand? And so therefore, it is sacrilegious, you know. And what we have seen over the years, over recent years, is a sort of drunkenness and the sale of alcohol and people misbehaving and turning a funeral, which is supposed to be a last respect, into a carnival.
Yeah. You notice, Richard, we kind of graduated or evolved from the traditional walking behind the hearse or the coffin and
Yes.
singing hymns to sometimes those who could afford might hire a police band.
Hmm.
But then you then had the introduction of the boom drum the guys
Yes.
from Rosebank and so forth with the boom drum. But now what you have are full hi-fi DJ systems on trucks as part of the procession. And so it has moved from, I mean, when the cortege passed, it was a solemn something. You were silent, you were quiet as the procession passed. But now it's almost, as you said, like a Carnival Monday band going around Kingstown, you know. And I'm sure there'll be mixed views. The traditionalists might lament on where things are. Those who are in favor of it may say, man, look, you gotta be with the times. But the effect of it as regards the sale of alcohol and the drunkenness and the misbehavior and the foul language around the church, around the cemetery, was something that we were never used to as a people. However, Richard, I'm going to have to stop you because James has entered the
Yes.
studio.
James.
So I'm going to
Okay.
bring James in right now as he's waiting patiently. And let's welcome James to this evening's program. James, good
Good
evening.
evening. How you doing?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Extremely well, thanks. Yeah, lovely to
Uh,
be with you.
Thank you so much. James, Richard, Professor Richard A. Byron Cox, call him Richard, is with us. Richard, James.
Richard, lovely to meet you.
The pleasure is mine. And you know, James, your energy and your excitement. I if I weren't told that you are English, I would think you're Vincentian.
Yeah, very
You
good.
know, you have this kind of bubbly kind of, you know,
Maybe that's why I feel so at home in St. Vincent. Who
you
knows?
know. No, seriously, he came across. This is not. I'm sorry, but this is not the fish and chips guy. But this is a roast red food and blackfish kind of guy. All of that is meant in jest, James.
Yeah,
Don't be
of
offended at all.
course.
It's just meant in jest.
Now,
You know.
James, as you mentioned, when was the last time you back in St. Vincent? Have you been there since burial? Have you been able to?
Yes, yeah. I was there in July after Beryl, after the general election in Britain. I came back, but then I've been back here since last month. I'm in
Okay.
London now.
Okay. And as always, quite your active self. Did you score century today, James? Did you make any runs today?
We got rained off.
Ah,
Terrible. This is one of the main problems with being back here. The weather is unreliable. They managed to get enough of the cricket. England managed to do badly against Sri Lanka at the Oval today, but my game at Beaconsfield got rained off.
Okay. You know, James, allow me to tell James this. You know, James, when I was at school, one day the teacher asked the students to write an essay on the greatest cricket match I've ever seen. One guy wrote this: "Rain came, no match." Yes. I mean, just to say good afternoon to Latoya Paul. It's good to see you. Welcome. And
yes, we
please
missed the
do let
last
us.
week.
Yes,
James,
James and
I was looking at, well, I was looking at that match. I kind of had a wager that match would draw, but it's good that Sri Lanka did some damage. But today's only day 3, so England could still win tomorrow if rain doesn't come. And so you've been back. What's your impression in terms of the work, James, that we have to do? I mean, I know you're not an official, you have not gone around and done an official assessment, but you were there, you experienced it. In terms of the work that you think Simmons and Andy has to do for reconstruction and rebuilding, what's your impression? What's your take initially?
Well, I didn't get down to the Southern Grenadines, so some friends of mine were there and were doing some relief work and some help for the communities down there, and were telling me how terribly affected so many people were. But I didn't see that myself. I was just up on mainland,
Okay.
and there was some. I mean, there was some obvious damage, and a couple of my neighbours got flooded.
Yes.
But thankfully, it wasn't. Things weren't too bad. I mean, it's alarming, obviously, it coming so early in the year and so so hard and strong, and it's unmistakable it's happening. I mean, walking along the beach, you can see the impact it's had to people's properties and to the shoreline and so on. But it didn't seem, at least when I was there, and I came after Beryl had passed through, it seemed, it didn't seem too bad. I also went to Beckway, and some buildings had lost their roofs, and some people were quite badly affected, but lots of people were also fine. But people worried about people in the Southern Grenadines. That's what I came across.
Okay. Seeing if you allow, please.
Sure.
James, you were on the program before. I happen to know about you because I'm pretty close to Cian, and he explained who you are. But Cian, if you don't mind, I think there might be people who are joining us for the first time who don't really know who James is, and it would be great if he could just tell them a bit about who he is and why we have him here, or you can do it. But I think there are people who really, well, at least two persons in Boxman asked me who really is James. That's why I'm saying that.
That's right. So James, like you did last time, give the viewing audience a bit of a history, briefly, of who is James Schneider, political activist, political strategist, communications professional.
Well, that's very kind. I'm from London, and this is where I was born and grew up. I came to St. Vincent for about 3 years ago. I shouldn't say this because it's illegal, but hopefully they won't find the person who's at fault on a one-way ticket. I talked myself in at the at immigration. They just started up the Virgin direct flights, and I needed a bit of a break. Wanted to somewhere else to go. Most of my work at the time was remote. I'll come to that in a second. So I could do it from anywhere, and I wanted to see what St. Vincent was all about. I'd heard about it. There's a Vincey guy that I used to play cricket with, who had told me a bit about the country. So I was excited to go. So I spent quite a lot of the last about 3 years in Indian Bay on mainland, and absolutely in love with St. Vincent and the Grenadines. My sort of back story, I suppose, I used to be a journalist. I used to be a journalist focused on Africa. I used to get to travel around the continent and edit and report and so on. And then I fell into politics. I set up a grassroots left-wing organisation called Momentum that backed Jeremy Corbyn when he became the leader of the Labour Party, and then I was his press secretary when he was the leader. And then since then, I've been the communications director for the Progressive International, which is an international network of political parties, trade unions, social movements, campaigns all around the world. And then I was involved in the last general election. I ran Jeremy Corbyn's campaign which was successful in Islington North, in his constituency, which I live 5 minutes outside of.
And I'll come to that because I wanted to discuss a little bit about, I plan to contextualize Labour's win and the landslide in terms of percentages and numbers. And to do that, you go back to Jeremy Corbyn's stint. James, recently you were an observer for the general elections in South Africa.
Yes.
Give us a bit of your own observations there. First of all, one of the most surprising things I think that would have come out from that for people who weren't following is the fact that the ANC for the first time has lost its majority vote, and as a result has had to team up with, you guessed it, the Democratic Alliance, the white party of the former apartheid people. But what's your observation, first of all, in terms of the state of politics in South Africa, and were you surprised by the outcome of the general elections?
No, I wasn't surprised, because the ANC has been in power now for 30 years, And while there have been a number of advances in the last 30 years, I think for most people in the country, if you told them 30 years ago how things would look in 2024, they wouldn't have believed you. I think expectations were much, much higher for
that's true.
What what ordinary people could expect from the state in terms of in terms of services, in terms of housing, and so on. I also think people underestimated the how deep apartheid was into the structures of the economy and the very physical geography and urban geography of the country, making it extremely difficult to overcome that even in 30 years. But it's in that context that they didn't lose the election. They still got around double the votes of the next party, of the Democratic Alliance, which is a sort of centre-right. Mainly, they're led mainly by white South Africans, and they represent white South Africans. Although, of course, a great number of non-white South Africans, of course, vote for them because they get another sort of low 20s of the percent of the vote. And that was the main story of the election, was the ANC for the first time having to form a coalition. And the big question was whether they would be able to. There were sort of three possible coalitions that they could form. One was if it was one where they would be totally dominant. So let's say they have a pure proportional electoral system. So if you get 50% of the vote, you get 50% of the seats, give or take. There's some variation due to provinces, but that is near enough that. And if they had got, say, 47 or 48, close to 50%, they could cobble together to get over 50 with very small parties, of whom there are a lot. I think there's something like 18 parties in the parliament, and in effect they would have a majority. Then the other two options: one was to go into coalition with the parties that came third and fourth, which in some ways are sections of the ANC or factions of the ANC in exile. There's the Economic Freedom Fighters, who were formed 10 years ago, effectively from the ANC youth wing splitting off, or leaders of the ANC youth wing splitting off and forming the Economic Freedom Fighters. And then MK Mkhonto weSizwe, a new party formed by former President Jacob Zuma, which particularly appealed to Zulu voters, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, where it had its base. So it was whether there would be a kind of the ANC supermajority coalition coming together across the three parties. Now, that didn't happen, and that's what, let's say, Western leaders would be particularly upset about happening, and that's what, let's say, Big Capital did not want to happen. And instead, what they've got is what they call a government of national unity, which is in effect the ANC in government with its main opponent, the Democratic Alliance, which doesn't come out of the ANC tradition, and then a couple of other small parties, which again are from different, more right-wing traditions or recent parties. There's a recent party, the Patriotic Alternative, which is basically a xenophobic party from the right, who they've gone into coalition with.
Now, let me do this. Oh my God, what am I doing? Right. Now, I was a bit, I don't know why, but I was following the politics, and I saw the rise of the MK party towards the beginning of the elections, and I was somewhat surprised by how well they did. But I'm reminded of the words of what's his name, CIC Julius Malema, who said that MK voters were supporters of the former president, who rested with EFF, but when the MK started, they just gravitated to their natural home, and so he wasn't very surprised. But I was a bit surprised. Maybe I wasn't as much involved or paying as close attention as I should have. But I was a bit surprised as to how well Zuma did. Do you think it's practical for those left-wing parties, MK, EFF, Freedom Front, and so on, to try and maybe form a coalition, work together if they are to have any real chance of unseating the ANC?
Well, that's what they're talking about. There are efforts to bring together MK and the EFF, but also there are persistent rumours about figures in the EFF and the MK wishing to do deals with the ANC to bring the whole family back together, as it were. You know, you have about 70% of the population, and it has been about 70% of the population since 1994, who are voting for parties that are in the struggle tradition, parties that are in the tradition of the ANC, whether they are in the ANC or split off now, like EFF and MK. And while they do have an ambition to, and they have an opening now, really, because the ANC has gone into alliance with parties that are outside of the struggle tradition, outside of the anti-apartheid tradition, really. But I think they have a real problem, which is the personality of Jacob Zuma, who is the focal point for this bit of the opposition, who is controversial, and rightly controversial, for reasons of corruption, for reasons of poor management, and so on. These are often presented but as sticks to hit the left by the more centre or centre-right parts of South African politics, including within the ANC. But that the forces that they represent, as in the EFF and MK, which is a critique of the ANC from basically within the tradition, which says that we were promised much more. We were promised transformation. We were promised that there would be a real social change rather than the enrichment of a small section of society, a bigger break, basically, more in the direction of socialism, which the ANC has not delivered on, and quite often the opposite.
Interesting. You know, one of I happened to visit South Africa, James, back in, I think it was 2008 or maybe 2007. I can't remember, late 2007, early 2008. I can give you one of my most fascinating discoveries about South Africa, which was that they refer to stoplights as robots.
Yeah.
that was something to me, because I kept hearing them talking about the robots. You go past the robot, and so I'm traveling around South Africa looking for these robots that they keep talking about. And only to find out that the reference was really to the traffic lights. But I really appreciate that overview of the South African situation for those who might have followed. If I may ask, and Richard, you could jump in here too as well and offer some perspective. But do you see with radical changes of government, coup d'etats in places like Cote d'Ivoire,
Burkina Faso,
and so forth, Mali, yes, and also with the rise of young progressives like President Faye, do you think that you've had serious unrest in Kenya, in Nigeria? Do you think that Africa might be awakening to a type of a revolution where they now start to look inwards and seeing the need for Africa as a continent separated by colonialism and by colonialist boundaries to come together and present a more united front globally than for the splintering of Africa as it is? I mean, I bring into focus, James, the whole idea of the Chidima issue that happened with the young lady who was born in South Africa, tried to participate in the Miss South Africa Universe pageant, but was given such a hard time because her mother was Nigerian and she wasn't seen as African enough. And the whole idea where some countries in Africa make it so difficult, and there's this anti-immigration attitude, even Africa among Africans. Do you see the whole movement recently as being a bit of an awakening?
Well, I think we have to hope that it is, because I mean, in very broad brush strokes, there was a huge amount of demands and organizing for Pan-African unity in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and that was hit it hard into reverse from that period on. And about 10 to 15 years ago, there was a big narrative, predominantly driven by investors from the West, but also from some elites across the continent, which was called Africa Rising. And the idea was that Africa could be a bit like the next China, and it would become very, very wealthy, and social questions of distribution of income and resources, these could be put on the back burner, because there were so many opportunities for people across the continent for rapid development. And what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is that hasn't been broad-based really at all. And now so much of the population across the continent is young. Such a huge percentage of the population is under 18. An enormous percentage is under 30. And this younger generation have grown up with where in almost every country there are fewer jobs and there are available than there are graduates coming out of university or out of high school. That development has been delayed and denied, and that comes up in different forms. That revolt comes up in different forms. But yes, you are seeing it in country after country, where you have youth-led, popular in character rebellions. We've seen in Kenya, very much recently. And it's interesting to see how, those started as reasonably elite youth, middle class young people making demands, and rapidly spread into a much wider, much deeper, much broader rejection of the existing order. We've seen similar things. There've been copycat. Copycat's probably the wrong word, actually. The general pattern of revolutionary change throughout history is that it's infectious, and so we've seen the beginnings of similar uprisings also in Nigeria. There's a longer standing process in Uganda going along the same way, and as you mentioned, Senegal has recently elected a progressive government off the back of large popular mobilizations. And yes, in Burkina Faso and Mali and Guinea, change has come through coups, but in Burkina Faso, there was also a big youth movement, and there was a movement called the Citizens Brew movement that was able to sweep away one previous dictatorial government. So I wouldn't say that there is that much ideological coherence. And I think people are feeling out for their commonalities and for Pan-Africanism, but the spirit and the movement is beginning to be there. And yes, you highlighted in West Africa, they are much more particularly talking the language of Pan-Africanism, the Senegalese government and the junta in Burkina Faso and Mali, and they're trying to work together more. These are and Niger as well, and these are small first steps, I think, and we're going from a very low base in terms of political development, in terms of connection between movements, but these connections are certainly being made, and ultimately you have a huge generation of young people throughout the continent who are better connected than they have ever been, who are therefore able to mobilize on a scale and learn from each other on a scale that we haven't had before. for whom the existing order promises very little. And that is generally in history, that's when things begin to kick off. And I think we're seeing bits of that now.
Do you see anything similar happening in the West? I mean, you had some uprising that started on university campuses by young people in the UK, in Europe, in the US. Do you see that as a start of the young people, the millennials, or whatever um, designation they have now, X, Y, Z? I'm not sure if they start in the
I
alphabet,
think they're
but
called Generation Z now, or Z.
Generation Z.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a start of the rejection that this young crop of voters are more in tune, more engaged, more involved, and they are more likely to reject the status quo?
So I think it's uneven. So speaking particularly, I mean, let's talk about Britain because I'm here. If you look at opinion polling for that for Generation Z, for young people, let's say people under 25 or so, they have political positions which are a big rejection of the status quo, and in line with the age cohort above, in line with millennials. But if you look at voting, I mean, almost half the population didn't vote in the general election that was held in Britain on the 4th of July. Only 52% of adults who would have been eligible to vote did vote, and the 18 to 24 age group had the lowest level of participation. So it isn't happening in an organized way. It's not happening through the ballot box at the moment. My worry, and maybe this is the worries of someone who's not in that generation, and every generation above worries about the younger generations. But from the activism and organizing I've done here, I worry somewhat about the impact of COVID on that generation, having spent the end of their school years, and if they went to university, their university years, not going outside, in lockdown, not organizing with people, being very online. And online can be very useful. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation, the three of us now, if it weren't for the technology that we have. But we know that if you want to make real change, you also need to be organizing with people in the real world. And if you're not used to that, and if you're not socially used to that, that becomes more difficult. But yes, I mean, throughout Europe, you are seeing young people rejecting the existing order. In some ways, you see this with protests about Palestine, about the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Although the opposition to Israel's actions and Western government support for them, it runs very deep, actually, across societies in Europe and North America. If you look at the polling, and it isn't just young people that take that position.
Just before the elections, I got TikTok yet, James, because you had not been on TikTok up to recently. Have you started TikTok
now? I got TikTok 2 or 3 weeks ago. Yeah.
Because you were trending on TikTok and didn't know, and I had to be sending you those.
You're saying, why aren't you on TikTok? You are on TikTok, you just don't know. Yes, I've got an account now.
Fantastic. Because just before the elections, this young lady, Fiona Lal, I think is her surname, goes to prominence by destroying the then, well, she wasn't anything then, but she, Bravman, on live TV. And she seemed quite passionate and very much involved. What do you think of personalities like Fiona, and do you see others like her coming forward?
Somewhat. I mean, we need many more. We need everybody to lend us their enthusiasm and their passion and their skills. But yes, there's her. She came through. That was a fantastic holding to account, I think, of the former Home Secretary, who was really a horrendous government minister, really absolutely terrible. But not enough. We need more of these people. We need more people to come through. There's a lot of space, I think, for new voices and new leaders and new organising, most importantly, to come through in Britain. I'll give you one figure, which is at the last election, 37% of tenants, 37% of people who rent their homes voted. Now, this is an enormous area for organising for people here. About half of people in the country rent rather than are homeowners, and they weren't engaged because there wasn't anything particularly on offer for them. And rents have been rising dramatically over the last 10, 20 years in the UK, and there hasn't been sufficient organising for them. So I think there is, right, with new technology, there's scope for new stars to rise quickly, but that needs to be accompanied with serious organising, I think, to make that more meaningful for the lives of lots of people, so that they aren't just consuming somebody that they agree with, but that's helping them to take an action that will help them improve their lives.
Richard, do you have any questions so far that you want to throw at James?
Well, I mean, again, I want to thank you for joining us. And before I say anything else, I just want to ask everybody on the live to please share it. And those of you who are there, just say hello so that we know you're there. And if you have a question that you think we might be able to answer, post it and we will try our best to give you an answer. Now, James, there's much I would like to talk to you about, including the US, the British elections, including Keir Starmer, Sir Keir Starmer, your present Prime Minister. And I don't know if you read the book, The Keir Starmer Project, but there's such a book.
By Oliver Eagleton.
Yes, and you have honorary mention in that book, actually. Yes. I think you have honorary mention.
Yes, he interviewed before.
Yeah. I read a couple of other things, but I think that particular one. Yeah. So there's much I want to talk to you about. For example, as you know, Jeremy Corbyn, who you were his press secretary, got much more votes than Keir Starmer got this elections. But yet, because of the electoral system and so on, Keir Starmer is Prime Minister, right? Even though he got less votes than Jeremy Corbyn. And that tells you something about the electoral system in Britain and whether or not that should be reformed. And if so, how it should be reformed, okay? And things like that. As you know, there is George Galloway from the Workers' Party, and who was a Labour man for many, many years. And his own view as regards which is something you mentioned earlier, the Gaza issue and how Britain vote in relation to that Gaza issue, and things like that. And a matter of fact, he says Keir Starmer will take Britain into war within a year. And it seems that way. But before I do any of that, there's a fundamental question I want to ask you. Today, as we speak in this world, a lot of the major news network, including the BBC, right? They determine what is news and what is not news. Mm-hmm. Not only that, they give their own spin on what they determine is news and what is not news. So my first question to you is, as a journalist and as a professional in the field of communications and public relations, could you advise young people, including myself? I'm not young. Let's not confuse the issue here in terms of age. But could you advise people that we know that there are different news networks now, alternative news networks, like, for example, Democracy Now!, Real News Network, and so on. But for you, from what I have heard you said, and from what Cian has told me about you, could you recommend to our listeners tonight, those who are following us, what do you think are some of the networks that they should follow to get, a better sort of sense as to what the truth is as regards the world in the news? That's a very, very important thing, I think, to a lot of people.
Well, I think Democracy Now! That you mentioned is particularly good, gives a particularly good roundup of events in the world. And I also think Al Jazeera English is, generally speaking, a good news source to follow. But I think it really depends on what issues people are interested in following, because now through social media and through specialist media, you can find really high quality news sources and analysis and information that will never make it through to mass media, however good it is.
Exactly.
So you can see that in we've seen that with the war on Gaza, that for people to follow that, there are people on the ground who, through following their social media and analysts of them, you'll get a better view. On other issues, let's take climate change, for example. There are particular specialist outlets and some scientists and so on who, through following them on social media, you will get a better news than you will get from tuning into CNN or whatever it may be. So I think we have to be the era of just, and this is the same for news organizations as it is for us citizens of the world, the era of just tuning into one or two channels and letting them decide what is the news is over, because we've already moved away. We've already moved away from that. I also think that people are now rightly much more skeptical about media, because they can see and feel exactly like what you're saying. It's not a conspiracy to say that a media house selects what it views as news. And if a media house, for example, is owned by a billionaire, the billionaire will appoint the chief executive. The chief executive will appoint the editor. People don't like to upset their bosses, at least not on too regular a basis. The chief reporter doesn't want to upset the editor, and so on and so forth. So you get throughout an outlet, the news values are shaped by the ownership structure. They're shaped by the interests of the senior figures within it, which are often interests quite different to the ordinary persons. They're much more likely to be wealthy and to have connections and so on and so forth. So, but I think people can see and realize that, which is why. Especially we were talking about younger generations. So many people consume all of their news on social media. Of course, they're consuming news that comes from traditional media, but just on social media.
TikTok is a primary source of news for the Gen Zers. That's where they admit that they get a lot of their news. So much so that the Democratic National Convention, had a space for over 200 content creators on social media, and that actually upset the traditional media with the treatment that social media content creators got. In the same way that you, James, seem to be upsetting people in the media with your views. Richard seems to have dropped out. I hope he finds his way back. But he mentioned something that I actually had listed, and I think he touched on it a bit: the level of engagement, because you have a landslide in the last elections of over 400 seats to just over 100.
Yeah.
But when you check back to when Corbyn was in charge of the Labour Party, he actually got more votes and lost that election. Does that speak to the level of engagement that exists within the political system, and how interested or in tune the British public was with the elections and with the choices available?
So the big story of the election that we just had is the wholesale rejection and mass loathing of the Conservative government, which makes lots of sense because they were in power for 14 years and most people's lives got worse. I don't think there's been a 14-year period in British history that has been worse governed, where things have got so obviously worse for most people. So the big story of the election was they lost over half of their votes on the 2019 election. And because we have a first past the post system, it's really the gap between parties 1 and 2 that matter, rather than the full distribution of votes. So the Conservatives lost more than half their votes. A further right party called Reform got nearly as many votes as they did, but only got 5 seats. Conservatives got, I think, something like 120 seats. And so Labour could, as you rightly say, lose votes on the 2019 election and gain a huge number of seats, a record number of seats. Same thing happened for the Liberal Democrats, the party that came third. They got marginally fewer votes than they got in 2019. In 2019, I think they got 12 seats, and in this election, they got 70-something seats, the most they've ever got. So these are the quirks and the vagaries of a not particularly democratic system. But it's not just the voting system which isn't democratic. The whole structure of politics isn't democratic because it's designed to chase out from politics the sorts of positions which are held by the vast majority of people in the country that challenge, in some mild way, the condensed wealth and power that a very small number of people have in the country, and would redistribute that to the overwhelming majority of people. And a lot of the media ecosystem and so on is set up to say that those ideas are impossible and implausible and not real. And that is in part why you have such a low engagement with politics in general terms, and particularly, I mean, the turnout went down quite dramatically in this election, in part because it was a foregone conclusion, but in large part because the gap between what was on offer, particularly on economic policy, particularly on what how much money is going to be in your pocket and how, very, very little difference between the main two parties, which doesn't lead to inspiration and engagement. Then the other things that could lead to inspiration and engagement are on social questions, and on that, the Conservatives had gone far in a reactionary direction, and Labour had sort of quietly tacked behind them so that there wasn't a huge gulf. Labour was in a less reactionary position, but it wasn't a huge. They weren't trying to be very, very different on policy areas. They were trying to be different on being different managers and saying the Conservatives have ruined everything, which was true, and therefore vote for us because we will be better managers of the system, without saying here is either what will inspire you or here's what will directly improve your lives.
Okay. Cian, if I may, James, this is all tied into what you just said, and I'd like to come a little bit closer to that whole analysis, and in particular, as you know, Keir Starmer has said of his new budget that it's going to get worse before it gets better. Those were his words. You know this,
Yeah.
But I don't want to get there yet. I wanted to ask you another question as regards journalists and journalism. Now, I don't have to call the journalist's name. A very famous journalist was arrested and detained recently in your country. An elderly woman who just simply tweeted something, was charged, and now she can't even use her own telephone or computer. I don't have to call these names. I'm sure you know them very well. This journalist you know very well because you're a journalist yourself. Very famous young man. And he was held and so on. My question to you, James, is this. You are from the left, as far as I understand it. You were Jeremy Corbyn's press person and so on. Corbyn is a genuinely left person. He's a genuinely Labour person. He's a genuinely worker representative. I have no doubts in my mind whatsoever as regards Jeremy Corbyn. None. I have none. And if you were his front man as regards communication, it therefore means that you share his philosophy. That's my view of how I see you. Now, if this is correct, do you have any fear, James? Because even some of what you have expressed to me in your answer to me and in your last answer to Cian, even some of what you express, the powers that be don't really like to hear that kind of language. Do you have any fear as a journalist that you being, so open and explaining these things to people, in particular the political system and the powers that be wanted to maintain their power and so on? Do you have any fear that these things that has happened to the two persons I'm talking about
Mhm.
has happened? Do you have any fear that this would happen to you as a journalist?
Well, I don't think anybody's about to give me my own show or anything like that.
You're always welcome here. You're always
Thank
welcome
you
here.
very much. I think that there's more danger for activists than there are for journalists who do the real job, of seeking out truth, finding out things that powerful people don't want people to know, and bringing those things to light. Most people who have journalist in their job title, or reporter or something like that in their job title in the British media, they don't do that. They aren't journalists of that sort. The state in the last few years has become more repressive, particularly towards protest. And we've seen some really quite extreme jail terms. For example, 5 environmental protesters were given 5 years. Well, 4 got given 4 years, and 1 got given 5 years in prison for what they said in a Zoom meeting that had been recorded by a so-called journalist from the so-called newspaper The Sun, which then shot them to the police. So the environment for those that seek to challenge power is more restricted in Britain than it has been for really some time. I think.
But before you go on, James, okay, let me be very concrete. Do you consider Richard Madoff a journalist, yes or no?
Yes, of course.
Okay, that's all. Continue now. That's what I want to know. Because it's him I was talking about.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And he was detained earlier this week.
Continue. I didn't want to break your trend of thought. I just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page here.
Yeah. Of course. But things might be different if we had a well-resourced one publication, one outlet that was well-resourced, that was crusading, that was able to really challenge or shake up the public discourse. But we don't. We have people who can have very big followings. I mean, take Richard Medhurst, for example. He has very big following, particularly on YouTube. But he does his own thing, because that's one, we are able to do that. You can build up followers and a platform outside of the mainstream, but also he wouldn't be welcome within the mainstream at all. There are some corners of the media. For example, there's one publication called Declassified UK, which is particularly focused on British foreign policy, and it exposes a great number of things that the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office would really rather were not exposed. Both historical things, both things to do with colonialism, and current practices. For example, Britain's support for Israel, the use of RAF flights, training, and so on and so forth for Israel in the ongoing war on Gaza. But these people are kept marginal, and they used to have some of them were given a berth previously in the liberal ends of the media. The liberal end of the media would stay liberal. The Guardian, the Mirror, the New Statesman, they would stay liberal, but there was space for people like John Pilger or Seamus Milne or so on, who would carry on similar types of journalism to the people that we are talking about, ones that really did challenge power, was not afraid to challenge the British state, and that space no longer exists. When the Guardian worked on the WikiLeaks story and the findings from Edward Snowden and the mass snooping on the world by the US NSA, one of their 10 secret service agencies. The British, the Guardian published this, the premier liberal newspaper, and the British state cracked down very hard on them afterwards and made them destroy the hard drives in the basement of their offices in central London. And from that date onwards, pretty much, the Guardian has at best pulled its punches with regards to really challenging power. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't good work that's done there. Of course there is. But it tends to run with the flow of power. So it's easy, you can investigate the wrongdoings of people that are state enemies, which are real wrongdoings, but they are. But then if you are to try to investigate wrongdoings that are done by the state, it becomes much more difficult.
Okay.
James, you mentioned that, and we talk about the prevalence of social media and the work of the powerful elite in attacking journalists. So you see within recent times, people like Mehdi Hassan losing his job from MSNBC on the Gaza issue. You see, for example, Mark Lamont Hill losing his job at CNN. And even in the young lady, I can't remember her name, who lost her job from The Hill. There was one famous broadcast on LBC.
Yeah.
A lady of I think it's a Muslim lady who lost her job and was replaced by a white right-leaning lady. Mind you, I respect James Corbyn on LBC. I think he's doing a fairly decent job. Of course, one of my favorite, as you know, as I expressed to you, Owen Jones, who does a fantastic job on YouTube. So you're seeing a lot of individuals who were shunned by the mainstream media going to social media and doing some fantastic work on social media. And of course, Richard isn't very much in tune with social media and TikTok like I am. But he would know, he would know that you've taken on the best and really younger them. Is it Mercer, James Mercer, the was now taking on the role of spokesperson for the Israeli government. You've taken on Piers Morgan, you've been on all of those talk shows, and you've really ruffled some feathers on all of those shows. So there is a space, and with the reliance of Gen Zers and even individuals like me who go to social media, I think that social media is having a significant impact in spreading the information. And so maybe people are becoming more and more less and less reliant on mainstream media. And so maybe they, after all, losing their grip.
Well, I think they actually lost their grip a long time ago.
Absolutely.
But they've lost their grip, but we have yet to build our alternative. And I think that's the same. That's the same across media, but also across politics, across the system as a whole. And you can see that they feel like they've lost control, because what has been the US political elite's response to the fact that the majority of people in the US, if you look at polls, are radically opposed to US policy in Israel, and even more dramatically with young people. It's to say that the protesters are being funded by China in Iran, which is preposterous, and that it's because of a plot by China through TikTok to control the minds of young people, rather than the obvious fact, which is if you show people horrors on their screens, they will react accordingly. The same moral panic happened within the US-American elite over TV reports from the Vietnam War and the role there in driving domestic opposition to that horrendous war. And simply, if people know what is going on and people have an opportunity to know what's going on, more and more they aren't accepting the official narrative or the official instructions for how to behave and how to respond. Our job, I think, is to take that and to build what would be an alternative, build sufficient power that can be expressed, that it's not just dissatisfaction, that dissatisfaction can then lead to change, which is a big gap. That's the job of organizing.
Cian, I need to ask James this because this is important. You are, well, Cian knows you much better than I do. As a matter of fact, it's thanks to Cian I know of you. And then I read a few things, as I mentioned, and which you can testify to. But tell me this, and I'm deadly serious. You you know Jeremy Corbyn. I have never met the man, but I've listened to him speak many, many times. And I'm deeply convinced as to who he is. He's a man of true integrity. There's no if and buts about that in my mind. None whatsoever. I have never met him. Just from listening to this man talk. And what I really would like to know from people like you is what allows you to keep that faith? Look what they did to Jeremy Corbyn. Look how they undermined him and tried to destroy him. A matter of fact, as you know, he was expelled from the Labour Party by Keir Starmer. You know this. Now, what is it that makes people like you still have this faith, this hope? Because I hear you talk, and I'm deeply convinced that you haven't given up hope. As a matter of fact, you never even thought of giving up hope. What is it that inspires you? What is it that keeps you coming back? What is it that tells you that even with all their power and with all their money and their control of everything, you're still willing to fight? What is it makes you do that? And I honestly would like to know.
Now, James, before you answer that, I want to add to that as well because Richard refers to and because I listen, I have a long list of things I wanted to discuss with you. So Richard mentioned that, which dovetail Richard into something I wanted to ask James because Jeremy Corbyn might have been the start of the Stammer purge. Coming towards the election, he tried with Diana Abbott, the first black woman to be elected to parliament. He tried to get rid of Diana Abbott out of the party by saying she's not going to contest. A brilliant young academic, Faiza Naheem, he got rid of Faiza. She couldn't contest, putting in one of his cronies into a show seat or a seat that Faiza had worked so hard to narrow the gap in the previous election. So clearly, the elite is trying to get rid of anyone who challenges the status quo, who has a different opinion, who seems to be people of integrity in the case of Diane, in the case of Pfizer, in the case of Jeremy Corbyn. And so the question is, they're not just going after the old ones like Jeremy and Diane. They're also going after young people like Pfizer and Owen Jones, who decided to leave, and you yourself, who became disenchanted with Labour. And so the question really is, what is it that keeps you fighting?
Well, I think if our rulers have to work so incredibly hard to trash people that want to do really quite mild, moderate things to improve the lot of people, then they can't have a very strong grip on things. And that's what really keeps me going. The fact that they had to work so hard to, as you say, destroy or undermine Corbyn's leadership, to me is not a sign of strength. That is a sign of weakness. And so it's not only that there's a necessity to organize to defeat this sort of power, but that it is indeed possible. And that we've seen again and again and again in history throughout the world, this very thing happened, that in the face of attempts to shut down people who are organizing and mobilizing for change, that nevertheless change still happens. I think within the Labour Party and shutting down space and so on, that what happened in Britain is that in the 2017 election, there was a snap election. And Theresa May, the Prime Minister, she was meant to win by a huge landslide. They started 25 points ahead in the polls. And Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party put forward, an unvarnished, straightforward set of policies where taxes would be increased on those at the very top, on big businesses, on banks, and on millionaires. And this would be used to fund health, education, housing,
public works.
transport, the
Yeah,
things that would benefit the vast majority of people.
of the people.
And
Yes.
that saw the biggest increase in polls in an election that had ever happened in any election in Britain, and the biggest increase in the Labour vote since 1945.
Mm-hmm.
And if something like 2,500 votes had gone a different way in the correct constituencies, then it would be Jeremy Corbyn, not Theresa May, who's in the pole position to form a government.
Yeah.
And this is very alarming for the ruling orders, because it's not a gain to them. I mean, there's real money at stake. Let's take, for example, in St Vincent, you're very lucky you have a publicly owned water company.
Yes.
Britain, unfortunately, we do not. Water got privatized 35 or so years ago by Margaret Thatcher, and these companies were given away with no debt. And now, 35 years later, they have around £70 billion worth of debt. And over that same course of time, £70 billion has been paid out in dividends to shareholders, many of whom are in tax havens in Jersey and Guernsey and so on and so forth. So they pumped up the debt and they've shipped out the money, but also they have pumped sewage and toxic things into our waterways so that people can't swim in our rivers and along our beaches. Now, this is an obvious and shameful rip-off that has been done to the people of this country. Now, if the policy of a government that is very close to, or a party that's very close to coming in, which was our policy, was to take those companies back, if you are the shareholders of those companies, then you've got real money at stake, because £70 billion over 35 years is quite a lot of money, and you want that to you want that press to keep dumping money in your bank account for not really having to do very much. And so from that point on, there was a real organized effort to prevent him winning. Fine. But then since 2019, when we lost and the Conservatives won a majority of 80, there's been an effort to chase those ideas and people who support those ideas out of the public discourse. And you end by him, but it's a broader thing. You see it within the media ecosystem, who gets invited on. You see that in what's seen as acceptable by the political media class, and you end up with a very strange situation of the last general election, where we had a huge landslide and people voted out the Tories. So I'm delighted that they voted out the Tories. It was absolutely terrible government. It's very, very, very good that they lost. But so three of the biggest issues that were going on at the moment, which are the cost of living crisis and the incredible levels of inequality which are rising in Britain, that wasn't really debated. The war in Gaza wasn't really debated because the parties didn't have similar positions. And climate change, when 2023 had been by miles the hottest year on record, and 2024 is set to outstrip it already, and the impacts are already being seen with hurricanes and flooding and fires and failed crops and so on and so forth. These things weren't debated because they aren't, because people who put them on the agenda have been as much as possible chased out of public debate. But they can't really be, they can't really be for long, because you can see it around the edges. In the last election, there were some independents. Jeremy Corbyn was one of them, but some others who ran not particularly connected to one another before they started running. And again, we had a snap election, so there wasn't that much planning ahead of time. But 5 independents won to the left of Labour. I think previously, since 1945, there'd been 3 across that whole period. 5 were elected this time. So you can hold down. You can stick your finger in the dike. You can prevent the dam from bursting for only so long, I think, and unless you're going to genuinely improve people's lives. And at the moment, there aren't any plans coming from the government and from the rest of the political media class to do so. Richard, you were just talking about the budget and saying that things are going to get worse before they get better. And we've heard all of this before. This exact script was what happened when the Conservative government came in 2010. That we're going to have to make unpopular decisions. That so on as all these things are going to happen, which we know is economically ludicrous. That isn't, that's like you've got your garden and it's been a bit underwatered.
Yes.
And you say, well, it's a bit underwatered, it's a bit dry, the tomatoes aren't coming up very well. So what we're going to do is not put any water in. And we'll just keep on not putting any water in, because at some point the tomatoes will learn that if they don't have enough water, they'll learn how to
grow without it.
And we know that this logic doesn't work. There's basically not a country in the history of the world where we're doing this works. And we're seeing in almost every aspect of the public realm in Britain, we're seeing the response, the after effect. If you make cuts in investments 14 years ago, that starts to come to fruition now. Then when your schools have to close, or kids can't go back to school because they're worried the buildings are going to crumble and collapse.
Or when you don't have any police officers to stop the riots against innocent people across Britain.
Quite precisely. We have so many, so much of this is the problem. And as we know, there is money that could be available. I mean, the wealth of people, all people collectively in Britain, has risen by 58% since 2008. It's gone right to the very top. There is more wealth than there was before the financial crisis in Britain, by quite a lot. 58% more is really quite a lot. But the ordinary people don't have that, and that wealth is not showing up in investments and things that everybody gets to enjoy, in health, in education, in transport, in our environment, and so on. So instead they say tough times ahead.
Okay, Cian, I have this very difficult question for James. And James, you can refuse to answer it if you don't want to, but it's a difficult question. And it's very simple in terms of language. Who owns the British government? America? Israel? The corporate society in Britain? The political class? Or somebody else? Could you tell us who owns the British government?
So,
what do you?
Yeah, it's not too difficult a question. I think it's quite an important question. It's a combination between the interests of the US, who essentially dictates British foreign policy, and corporate interests, which right through most of British state policy interests. And you see this in a great number of ways. So corporate lobbyists get seconded into the offices of politicians, and they can help write the laws, which then work to their interests rather than to our interests. So the British state, in an uneven way, where different interests can play out, and there are areas for there are areas for nuance and for change to happen, but in the aggregate, it follows the interests of the corporations overall. If you were to really sort of strip it back.
So there's no Israeli ownership, not even 10%, you think?
No, I mean, Israel is an ally of Britain, but I think that the policy direction on foreign policy mainly comes from the US and US interests to Britain, and that way round, rather than that way around. I mean, Israel is a substantially smaller, poorer country than Britain. I mean, it can't, it does not have the capacity to directly influence the British state in such a way. That doesn't mean that there aren't efforts to lobby. There are from, for example, the Saudi government, which has strong ties to the British state and to sections of particular interest in the arms industry and so on. Those same interests, arms industry in particular, their interest, and we've got one very powerful arms company here called BAE Systems. And of course, they have an outsized influence as corporate over the British government. And Israel and Saudi Arabia are two of their main clients, and they are hugely part of US supply chains for the military. So that has a large effect. But I think it, broadly speaking, goes that way round, rather than Israel or Saudi Arabia directly purchasing control. I mean, Israel couldn't; it's sufficiently small. Saudi Arabia has much more money, but I think the interests mainly go round through the corporations that can make money out of those things and by US imperial strategy. Britain is a sort of subordinate state within the US imperial system, which is both a corporate system and a military system, and the relationship between those two things. And I think that's the main structure of the world system within which Britain sits, rather than something more conspiratorial, let's say.
Okay. There is this question I'd like you to answer for us. I know Cian is very interested in this as well. Very interesting question. George Galloway has called on Jeremy Corbyn to form a national front, something like what Mélenchon has in France. I'm now turned to French, sorry. Yeah, something like what Mélenchon has in France. I don't know where Jeremy Corbyn stands on it. What we do know is that he's now forming an alliance with the 5 independents. We know this for a fact, but we don't know whether or not he is open to the idea of what George Galloway is saying. Now, from your own standpoint, 2 questions. One, what is do you have any idea as to his reason or his objective behind this kind of alliance with these 5? A matter of fact, people have even been calling him Arabists and Islamists and so on, and all sorts of nonsensical foolishness, to be honest with you, because of that. But if you could explain a little bit about that, and then your own view as regards George Galloway's view that Jeremy Corbyn, because George has said that he would bring all that he has and he would encourage everybody else, but Jeremy would be the leader and he's willing to follow him. What are your views on those 2 things, please?
So first of all, on the Independent Alliance in Parliament, since they were elected, these 5 independent MPs who, as I say, didn't really know each other that much and weren't that connected before the election, but were all elected on a similar platform, which is opposition to British complicity in Israel's genocide in Palestine, and broadly progressive anti-austerity type politics. They had different emphases, different ones, but they were all broadly in the progressive camp. And since getting to Parliament, they've all begun to work together and work together very constructively on basically every issue that has come to Parliament. And they are already, de facto operating as a group. They meet, they discuss, they share things, they stand on platforms together, and they also work with the Greens. The Greens got 4 MPs elected as well, and so they've formed a group. They've turned that de facto group into a de jure group, of the five of them, which is also open to other like-minded people. They've put out a statement about what their sort of mission and values are, which are in favor of peace, action on climate change, against cuts to public services, support for workers, broadly speaking, progressive politics. And they're going to work together more in Parliament on that basis. That's in the here and now. Now, on the Nouveau Front Populaire type idea, I very much support that idea, but with a caveat, which is that was formed because of an election, close to an election. And I think that we want to get to a point where at the next election, the progressive forces, however they are arranged politically, Greens, independents, new parties, existing parties, whatever it might be, can form such a bloc. But as in the French case, which it brings together primarily four parties, you need to have one driving force. And in the French case, it's Jean-Luc Mélenchon's La France Insoumise, who is the closest analogue, let's say, to Jeremy Corbyn and his politics of the other ones. And because those are my politics, and that's what I would like to see, I would like to see those forces develop more over the coming 2 or 3 years, so that we can be in a stronger position when we form that alliance to then fight at the next election. So to me, the question is more, how do we build up the organized forces that speak for those values, those interests, so that come, before the next election, a year before the next election, or whatever it may be, that sort of alliance, which is then a broad electoral pact that says we are going to go into the next election together. This is how we are going to divvy it up. This is how we're going to share resources. This is our shared platform. So that can be done from a position of strength. There's still a long way to go now before the next election. We've got 4 or 5 years
to go,
and a lot of things can happen in that time. So I support the idea of a front, of a pact, of an alliance, whatever you wish to call it. But I think the time for its formation or its formalization is down the line. I think for now we should have people working together inside and outside of political parties, in social movements, in trade unions, in the peace movement, in the anti-racist movement, in the trade unions, and so on, environmental movement, with people in different political parties and no political parties, and see how those things develop, so that we can bring those together in a stronger, more coherent, and more powerful way come the next election.
Are you still close to Jeremy Corbyn?
Very, yeah. I was.
You just said, Richard, that he managed the campaign.
Yeah, he managed his campaign. Okay, all right.
Now, James, I want us to move now into this last segment. It's amazing how time has flown. We've already been an hour and a half, and I didn't plan to keep you for this long. But this is really exciting, and I know our viewers are enjoying the discussion because you bring so much to the discussion, speaking from a Brit who is very much involved in the politics. So we've established that there isn't much in terms of policy difference. One of the questions I had to ask you was if you could identify maybe 3 to 5 major policy differences between Labour and the Tories. But you've established very early that there isn't a whole lot. So I want to discuss something that I think is intertwined. Recently, you had riots across England, and the target of those riots was immigrants. This is the remnants of the anti-immigrant messaging from the Tories for many, many years. However, Labour has not distinguished itself as a party that is necessarily pro-immigration, since some of their own actions and rhetoric have also been anti-immigrant. First of all, broadly speaking, can immigrants expect a better deal from the Labour Party? And can they expect a change of rhetoric coming from the leadership that can work to lessen the tensions that exist between Brits and immigrants?
So I just want to start by slightly changing the terms of what the riots were and who they were against, because they were racist, violent riots and attacks, and they weren't against migrants per se. They were against black and brown people, and they were against Muslims. Now, they weren't against people who are immigrants who are white, and they didn't discriminate between British passport holders who are black, brown, Muslim, and people who have arrived recently, and so on and so forth. So I think we should call a spade, and in this case, they were racist. They were racist actions.
Bless your soul.
Then there is actually a big difference, which says more about where Conservative politicians are on this issue than it does about where Labour are on this issue. But there is a big difference between them, which is a decent chunk of Conservative politicians and the Reform politicians to their right are firmly camped out now in the hard right and some in the far right, who were trying to carry water, especially in the early days before the violence became so stark and so undeniable that they had to begin to distance themselves. But they still spoke in the language of these started as protests over legitimate concerns about the level of migration, which is entirely false. They started as an Islamophobic, a racist, anti-Muslim attack on a mosque in Southport, falsely claiming that Muslims, how Muslims could be collectively responsible for something, that it had been a Muslim who had stabbed and killed 3 young girls at a dance club, when it had not been. It had been a 17-year-old boy who was born in Wales, who, as far as I'm aware, according to media reports, is a practicing Christian. So it was a completely false basis. And even if it were a correct basis, the response would be not to attack a place of worship, not to collectively attack a minority. So there is a big difference, actually, between there's not, because Labour have come out and said with similar clarity to what I just said, calling exactly a spade a spade, but they did say that these were far right. They did call them racist. They lent more on the language of thuggery, which to me depoliticizes something which is inherently political and which has been stoked up as being political through our political and media discourse going back many, many years. I mean, this is not a recent thing. There is also another element to it, which I think is important, which is more recent, which is the far right and hard right conspiracy theory response to the enormous protests and demonstrations in support of Palestinian liberation and in opposition to the genocide in Gaza. Because Suella Braverman, who you referred to earlier, Sion, she was calling these weekly marches, peaceful, wonderful marches, hate marches, and said that London had been taken over by Islamists and anti-Semites. I think she even said the country had been taken over, and was very critical of the police, who she was responsible for as the Home Secretary at the time, over not shutting down these peaceful demonstrations. And this rhetoric has created this idea that there's 2-tier policing in Britain. We're not 2-tier as in the rich and the rest of us. Not 2-tier black and brown people and non-black and brown people and white people, but that the right-wing protesters and white people are treated worse by the state than black and brown people and their allies, which is, of course, objectively ridiculous. But it's been stoked up by the right of politics and the media, and Labour and Keir Starmer, because they are now the state. They've had to, they very clearly reject this, this far right conspiracy theory, because they're the ones holding the can. They're the ones that are in charge of the state, in charge of the police, in charge of the judicial system, and so on.
Mm. So and you're right. There was definite targeting of black and brown people. In terms of policy differences, one of the attacks that has been constantly repeated has to do with the NHS and the prevalence of migrants in the NHS. Do you see a space still for migrants in areas like the NHS and other service areas that are the more significant areas for migrants? For example, as well, there are many individuals from the Commonwealth who apply for the armed forces every year. Do you see those areas still being welcoming for migrants, for Commonwealth citizens, as they've been previously?
The NHS would stop functioning tomorrow if everybody who was born outside of Britain suddenly weren't here, and it's a statement of fact. It is a public service that is reliant on people coming from abroad. I personally think there's a problem with the insufficiency of training of doctors and nurses, and the charging of tuition to doctors and nurses training from Britain, and the poaching of medical staff from other countries. But that's a separate thing. So yes, but people will be welcome in the NHS, of course. I also think that the majority of people in the country, or at least the majority of people in large parts of the country, completely reject this kind of racist agitation that we are seeing in our media, in our politics, and unfortunately in our streets. And it's not it is not the majority position. I think one of the things that we have seen, and it's been I think it's been somewhat calculated, but it might have been as well predominantly an organic response, is in 2020 when we had the Black Lives Matter protest. They also happened in Britain in response to the killing of George Floyd, and they were big, and they were extremely popular. The majority of people in the country were in support. You saw it was a big cultural moment. All the players in the Premier League on the back had Black Lives Matter written on the back of their shirts. Footballers began taking the knee before games. And in 2021 at the Euros, the England team decided to take the knee, and the far right media and people in politics attacked them for it. And the country basically backed the team. This team, which looks like modern Britain, it's it's multi-ethnic, it's multiracial, it's all the rest of it, and very relaxed, and doesn't find any of it particularly. It's not weird or difficult. It's just completely normal. And since then, there's been this concerted effort to make asylum seekers, refugees crossing the Channel into an enormous moral panic, and to double down hard on particularly anti-Islam, anti-Muslim rhetoric. And this really does, all of this has to be challenged. It has to be challenged very hard, because we've seen in the past what happens if you are dragged along with this, if you appease it somewhat. I mean, we've seen this play out before. in the previous Labour government, when the right-wing tabloids would go on about this stuff, and their instinct was to sort of tuck in behind it, to throw it a bone here and there, to talk its language somewhat. And we're seeing that again now. The Labour government now, Yvette Cooper, who is the Home Secretary, yes, in the riot, she did call them racist and Islamophobic. But then she also uses the same type of language about how they're kicking out and making more deportations than there have ever been, and giving things to the media that they will report in exactly the same kind of screeching headlines, which are alarming to people, because I think the level of trust. I mean, I know as a fact from social scientific research, the level of trust in the media in Britain is extremely low. But where they're able to run a concerted campaign on an issue, it changes public perception. So there was a study, for example, in 2013, which asked the British public on a whole range of questions, what percentage of the population they thought were Muslim, what percentage of the benefits bill was being lost through fraud, and so on and so forth. And they all found that the public thought these numbers were much larger. And in part, that's because the perception is shaped by media coverage. If you have front pages, again, even if you don't read the stuff, but if you see benefit cheat, benefit fraud, etc., again and again and again, it's rational to think, well, that's got to be based on something. And at the time when they polled it, I think the public thought that 26% of the welfare bill was lost through fraud, when it was 0.6%.
Wow.
So this concerted campaign, you say it again and again, and there's only really one way to break that, which is to draw a clear line in the sand that you're not going to engage in it, and then give an alternative explanation to people for what's going on. You can't just say, no, you're wrong, you're racist. You have to say, no, it's not that. The reason why housing is too expensive, why you can't see a GP, why it's X, Y, and Z, and give the real reason. And explain that, no, it isn't migrants that mean you can't see a GP. It's that the last government underfunded the NHS. No, there is a reason why your pay is at the same level it was in 2005, because workers aren't allowed to organise for themselves to get a better deal. There's a reason why you can't afford a home, and it is because the super rich own too many homes, and that has expanded over the last few years. There's a reason why inequality is going up, and it isn't because we have migration. It is because the rich have been given phenomenal handouts through quantitative easing for the last 16 years, and so on and so forth.
James, so in terms of actual policies, and I speak to things like, for example, the changing of the restrictions on students coming over who would normally bring their families, that was blocked, and that has shown a significant drop in applications from international students. That is something that is impacting migration. The difficulties, for example, that were made, the changes that says somebody from Britain who wants to marry a non-Brit has to be making at least £38,000 a year before that could happen, and you could apply for citizenship for that person. All of these things were things enacted by the Tory government. Labour is here. Do you see any intentions of relaxing those things, making it reasonable for students coming over, for Brits to marry non-Brits, and other policies like that that seem to have been designed to clamp down on migration?
I think that in the short to medium term, things will just get less harsh. They'll get harsh more slowly. So they won't unwind those things, but they won't make them more aggressive. And I think conceivably over the kind of medium to long term, the especially on overseas students, that could be relaxed because there's it's a big export basically, and higher education has a sufficient lobby that they can say foreign students obviously bring in money into the sector, and I think the sort of civil service consensus position, which Labour will end up leaning in they'll move towards that over time, is that it shouldn't be made so difficult for foreign students. But Keir Starmer ran for Labour leader in 2020, saying that he would always champion migrants, he would defend freedom of movement as we left the EU, that he would close the detention centres at Yarlswood. And of course, none of that kind of progressive type of policies will come forward. What I hope that they are forced into is some better rhetoric around having an inclusive society, but you need someone who can do it. I mean, if we had Tony Blair, for example, whose politics are a long way away from mine, but if he were prime minister when we had the riots, I think he would have taken it as an opportunity to say more about what kind of a society we are, and to frame that in a more progressive direction, even though his politics were not progressive and his government did a number of bad things in this direction, would have done that rather than just saying we are opposed to the far right buggery, to say more of we are a country that values our diversity and our inclusion, and that is what makes us strong, and nobody should feel afraid or not part of our society for any reason. And that this is a fringe minority, and we will, as in the violent racists are a fringe minority, and an attack on one is an attack on all. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we really should be hearing, because I think the overwhelming majority of people in the country would be positively moved by that sort of a thing.
Okay. Cian, if you allow, James, I can't let you go without asking you two important questions. And you don't have to answer them if you don't want to. But I think of a journalist of your standing, and I see in you, honestly, probably a future parliamentarian, because you have the principle. And that's what I like most about you. When I listen to you speak, I see a man of deep principle. And a man without principle, for me, is not a man, But I have to ask you these two questions, which are important. One is, what's your take on British position as regards the Ukraine situation? As you know, Keir Starmer seems to be willing to sign up Britain to 100 years of defense of Ukraine, right? That is what it seems to me. And I think from listening to you and from what Cian has told me about you, because this is my first time meeting you, I hope I'll meet you again sometime for sure. But from what he said, you are a journalist you're a communicator, public relations person who is very, very affair with all of these things, politically speaking. And it therefore means that you understand the kind of tinder that is being prepared for possibly nuclear war if we are not careful. That's one. So I'd like to hear your take on British relation to this Ukraine situation. That's one. And two, a more troubling question. What is your take on the American elections? And we have cackling. We have Kamala and we have the orange one. Yeah. So it would be nice to hear. I can see Sian is very uncomfortable with my question.
I'm not. No, your question is your question. You can ask your question. That's fine.
I think these are actually very related questions, because Britain's position on Ukraine will be mainly dictated by what the US position is and how that changes. So, For example, I read in the paper today, Grant Shapps, who was the Tories' last defence secretary, who was defence secretary until July of this year, calling for British missiles to be able to be used by Ukrainian armed forces to make attacks quite deep into Russian territory. Of course, a similar debate is taking place in the US, and it does stretch credulity somewhat that no US weapons have been used in that regard already.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the US greenlights that, then Britain will greenlight it. But of course, exactly as you say, in less than 2 months' time, there will be a US election. So it depends, I think, on what the outcome of that is. My view on that, I'm trying to avoid watching it. It's I saw the Democrat National Convention out the corner of my eye, and it looked very degraded. I was pleased to not pay it too much attention. It does seem that there are some substantive dividing lines opening up on economic policy, which I think is a good thing. But I'm under no illusions that basically neither of them are on my side, or I'm not on either of their sides. Let's say, if they provide different threats and different opportunities as everything does. I mean, for the rest of the world, I think in Europe, if Trump wins, that will strengthen the hand of those that want to see more strategic autonomy for Europe from the US, which wouldn't be a bad thing. But then we'd have Trump as president, which would be a bad thing. So there are. It all has to be played very cautiously. I think part of the problem for all 8 billion of us on Earth, not in the US, we sort of follow US politics a bit as if they are our own, and we take sides a bit as if they are our own, and less think about how can we get a bit of distance from the power of the US to have its say over so many aspects of global affairs. So I'm less cheerleading for one side or the other, although of course I want Donald Trump to lose, than seeing what impact it will have on the wider world.
A quick question, Jim, before you go. It's in 2 minutes because we're coming to the end of the show and so forth. Starmer will visit Dublin shortly. And based on reports, it's the first visit of a prime minister in probably 8 or so years.
Mm-hmm.
And an attempt at normalizing ties with that side. Do you see anything in the short to medium term that indicates that Starmer, the British government, would be also willing to strengthen ties with the Caribbean, with its Caribbean counterpart, especially with the situation where the Commonwealth not being as strong as it used to be, and countries within the Commonwealth moving away from the monarchical system, developing their own republics. Do you see any intentions in Starmer, the Labour government, to strengthen ties with the Caribbean region?
So I think there's probably a decent chance of that. Of course, they haven't made a big play about it. I mean, foreign policy hasn't made. They haven't gone very, very big on that, and their main thing has been rebuilding ties with the EU. But the Caribbean is a part of the world that Keir Starmer knows pretty well. He's spent, I think, quite a bit of time as a lawyer in different parts of the Caribbean. And the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, his heritage is Guyanese. And so he, of course, has an interest in the Caribbean and also in the Commonwealth. So I think it's a more medium-term thing. I think their the sort of first order of business is improving ties with the EU. And then we might see some things on the Caribbean. I think it would be good, actually, if things were coming somewhat the other way. If CARICOM states, for example, were putting forward their agenda towards what they wanted to see from Britain, that might help steer things, because I do think that this government, particularly the fact that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have some connections to the Caribbean, does mean that it will be more amenable, I think, than previous governments. So I think it's worthwhile. I would be under no illusions that they're about to transform relations between Britain and the Caribbean, but I think they're open for discussions probably. And if CARICOM countries were able to put forward some firm set of demands and shared projects, then I think there could be scope for something decent.
All right, James. This is where I say thank you so much for spending the evening with us. You
Thank
spent
you.
about 2 hours with us, James, and I really, really appreciate that. That's all of the time. It's more than I bargained for, and so I really, really appreciate all the assistance you give to our program, the quality you brought to this evening's discussion, and the insight that you've shared. I really appreciate, and I thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It was nice. It was nice meeting you.
Wonderful to meet you, Richard.
We'll
speak again soon, I hope.
To be honest with you, the 2 hours went so quickly. You have shared a lot. I do hope that you'll come back, because there are a couple of things I think that I'd like for you to sort of share with not just St. Vincent, but the Caribbean, and things that I think you, having worked within the political system, within the Labour Party. I am Labour. I'm socialist.
Yeah.
I will always be. I'll die a socialist. And so these are things that I think we ought to share. One other thing I would want you to share a little bit with next time you're back is a little bit about St. Vincent and your own appreciation for it, whether it's breadfruit or chichi cake or whatever it is. I'd just like to hear what is James Schneider's, view of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I really do hope that you will come back sometime.
I would love to.
It was really, really nice meeting you. It was really nice.
You too.
All right, James, take care. Good evening.
All right.
All right, that was James, Richard, and I really appreciate James spending the time with us this evening. The fantastic discussion went for 2 hours, flew by like
before you know what was happening.
But because I really didn't expect him to spend the entire program, but he was very much into it and really shared some very powerful insights with us this evening. Richard, as well, thank you as well for being my gracious co-host this evening as usual, and I do appreciate the assistance and the support that you give our program that to help it to grow. And maybe I need to tap into James as well to see what assistance he could offer. Thank you very much, Coach. Coach just mentioned Vinci is winning.
That is something I wanted to go to before you sign off, because we have Abigail Warner online. Good evening to you, Abigail, and thank you for joining. I hope you did share.
Abigail Warner is actually my niece, eh?
Yeah, right. She lives in England now, I think, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Right.
Yes.
His fans, good evening to you, and thank you for being here. Kojo, the Patriot Trout. Kojo is always there. Latoya Paul, it was great having you. And I hope you all will be back here next week. I just really wanted to say hi to all of you. And all the other persons who might not have said hi to us tonight, but you were there. I know some of you, because you have inboxed me in one way or the other, some of you. So I really want to thank you. See, and I think it was a fantastic program. And next week, can we make the announcement now, Sian?
No, here's the point. We have to cut before 2 hours because I need to cut clips and we're running very, very close.
Yeah.
So make the announcement quickly, 10 seconds.
Next week, I will be sharing it with you throughout the week, but I am on talking purely about the story of Pauline Bramble, the most brilliant literature book written for this year, for sure. No doubt about that.
And he'll be right here in the studio with me.
We would be in studio in London. Studio in London.
He would be joining me via the internet. He'd be here.
Yeah, we're in studio in London. So look for it and tell everybody. All
right. So until next week, Sunday, everybody, when I'm back with you for another program, on behalf of Richard, thanking James so much for this evening. I bid you a good Sunday evening. Take care.
All right.